going to talk a little bit about today and I'm calling this Because of Your Words. And I'm going to unpack this a little bit and try to go fast because I have a lot of content. But the gist of this is, what do you do when you have to fight or wrestle against, or not even necessarily fight, but come up against something that's really difficult in your life, something that's maybe so big that it's just out of your control, huge ideas. What does the Bible say? How do you do that and simultaneously walk it out with God? Because, a lot of times you hear about Christianity and being patient and turning the other cheek and stuff like that. What are you supposed to do when you come up against situations like that? And, when I say fight, I'm referring to conflict, problems, obstacles. So let me give you a few examples here. It could be something that as small as you yourself just fighting for peace internally. That can be a huge battle that shouldn't be overlooked. It's very important to have peace on the inside in your spirit. And if you go too long ignoring that, it can cause a lot of problems in your life. It can cause rot. And if you're not right, that's a big battle. It could be fighting for clarity, maybe, on what to do with your life, having vision for school, college, job. It could be maybe just parents fighting for unity in their household. Sometimes that can feel one step outside of your control. Like, I've done everything I can do. I've done everything I know to do to mend this relationship, and it just isn't working. Or it could be married couples, maybe fighting for your marriage. For everybody that's in the room knows unity is important in marriage, and unity doesn't come for free. It's something that you have to fight for all the time. You have to contend for unity in your marriage. It could be, like I said, job or career, or, and kind of what I'm going to talk about today, but it could be a real big problem that's out of your control, and that could be like the future of your nation, or your community, or your world. Maybe some of you have concerns for stuff like that, and you wonder, like, what can you do, Like, sometimes you feel like you want to see things be different in your nation, but you feel kind of powerless, like there's not a lot you can do about it. So we're going to kind of look at what this looks like, because, whenever I say the word fighting or contending, you guys probably think of the normal formula for how people do this. And it looks usually like starts with contempt on the inside for something or someone or some idea. Then it leads to gossip or trash talking. That's kind of how sometimes we passive-aggressively deal with situations. It evolves into arguing. Sometimes it gets physical if you're not careful. Then the problems scale up. They scale up to rioting and chaos. You guys have seen what that looks like. And then if you follow this pattern all the way, it leads to war and death. And so we know we can look at that and go, that's not really the best way to fight. I don't think that's what God would want for us to fight that way. So then how should we? How are we supposed to walk with God and simultaneously contend for things that we feel like maybe aren't right, or situations in our life that we need spiritual breakthrough in, is the best way to put it. So I'm going to tell you guys this story. Well, first off, I had a slide for my title here. I'll be coming back to this, but I'm going to tell you this story about this is a really old parable about a Chinese farmer, and I don't know if you've heard this before, but you're going to hear it today. So it goes like this. There's a Chinese farmer, has a really nice stallion. The stallion runs away. All the villagers come to the Chinese farmer and say, man, that's really bad that your horse ran away. And he says, maybe. The next day, the stallion comes back with 7 more stallions. And so the villagers come to him and go, wow, that's really, really good. And he says, maybe. So the next day, his son decides to ride one of the stallions and breaks his leg. So the villagers come in and go, wow, that's really bad. And he says, maybe. The next day, the inscription services for the military come by and they draft the firstborn sons of the house, and they don't take him because his leg's broke. So the villagers come around him again and go, wow, that's a really good thing. And he says, maybe. So the moral of the story is that we don't always know, right? And so don't be so quick to apply what you think is good or bad to a situation, because you're not really sure what's going on. And I use that parable to bring it into this. And I've read this before, but this is in Ephesians from Paul. He says, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. In other words, there's a lot more going on than we can see just with our eyes. And there's some really, this is something that I pray over myself that the Apostle Paul says. He says, he's speaking to God and he's saying, God, give me utterance so that I may be given boldness to make known the mystery of the gospel. There's some mysteries in the Bible. And if you'll press in and ask for understanding, God will give you that understanding. I'm going to go back and give you just a little foundation for this story first. So we're going to study somebody today in the Bible, but I'm going to tell you, there's a video series that I watch online. It's called The Bible Project, and these guys do a really good job at animating some of the stories and kind of helping it make sense. And so I'm going to read the history before I tell you the story. So let's back up all the way to the beginning, right? In Genesis 1, God creates a beautiful, ordered reality out of darkness and disorder so that life can flourish. He appoints humans as his representatives to rule over all of it. And 7 times God calls it good. But in Genesis 3, we meet a creature who is in a state of rebellion against his creator. You guys know him as the devil. He is on a mission to ruin God's good world for other creatures. He is the Bible's first portrait of evil, distorting what God has purposed for good, ruining and dragging creation back into darkness and disorder. And this is where Adam and Eve come in. You guys all know that story. The humans decide to join the spiritual rebel, which leads them back into chaos and death. From this point on, the human rebellion is now interwoven with the spiritual rebellion. The Bible shows all throughout, like as you read these stories and go and study it, and this is no different for human history, of how this pattern of rebellion repeats itself over and over again. And you know, if you study history at all, they'll tell you, like, humans perform things in patterns, and you can almost go back and look at it. It doesn't really matter what era you're looking at. You can almost predict the movements sometimes. And so it's important to study history so that you don't fall subject to the same issues, right? The saying is, whoever ignores history is destined to repeat it, or something to that tune. Anyway, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about another rebellion that's going on. You guys have heard the Garden of Eden thing, and you get that, but there's more to that story. If you skip ahead in Genesis 6, it talks about a second rebellion, and it says the divine council. In other words, you can think of the divine council as like God's heavenly staff team. Think of it like that. It says that in Genesis 6, after the snake comes the rebellion of the sons of God. It says they fall, and this is where it gets weird. Sorry, I'll explain it. They fall and they mate with women down on the earth, and they give birth to the Nephilim, or warrior giants. Now that's a whole sermon in itself. I can unpack that some other time, but this is where I'm talking about the mysteries of the gospel, okay? It says the ancient kingdoms were founded and also claimed, the ancient kingdoms claimed to be protected by giant warrior kings who were part human, part God, and filled with divine wisdom. And the biblical authors are actually saying, hey, these warrior kings that you're talking about are not godly. They should not be honored. They're actually evil spiritual forces. In this story, they are portrayed as human rebels that are captive to spiritual evil, spreading their violence in God's good world. And one of those kings in Genesis 10, and this is like kind of the story or the cycle that I'm going to zoom into, is his name is Nimrod. And some of you may know this story, but this is where humans decide to exalt themselves. And I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with the Tower of Babel. Have you ever heard about that? So King Nimrod spearheads this, and this is sort of a symbolic representation of humans not needing God anymore. That's what this is. So it's a symbol of disowning God and claiming their own divinity. And it's interesting, if you go read about Moses, he actually refers back to this and says, this is the moment where God scattered. Let me read his words here. He says, when Moses in Deuteronomy looks back at this story, he says, that is the moment when God handed over the nations to worship the rebel hosts of heaven, the gods of money, sex, and power. So in short, what I'm getting at with this foundation here is that demons and spiritual forces are at work behind corrupt human power structures. You understand what that's saying here? And so this is kind of when it all started. So I wanted to give you that little bit of foundation because I'm going to zoom in and to do a character study today of a guy in the Bible that you guys know. His name is Daniel. And you probably know him from Daniel in the Lion's Den. This is the same Daniel. But he had a huge journey, and there's way more to his story than just being tossed in a lion's den. And so I want to zoom in and focus on that. And I just want to say as a disclaimer, I'm not talking, whenever I talk about studying history like this and rulers, I'm not making any reference to our current president, the one before him, the one before him, the one before him. This has nothing to do with any of them. This has to do with us looking back and studying the patterns of humans and the cycles that they go on. You understand what I'm saying? So this is politic-free. This is history only. And I just want to say to all of that sounds really huge. And, talking about things like spiritual forces behind human power structures that are corrupt, that's a big thought. But, just to give you a real quick answer, if any of that sounds grim, God says in 2 Chronicles, and you can put this verse up for me, but if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear them from heaven and I will forgive their sin and heal their land. And I'm going to come back to that. But I'm going to study a guy who knew this well. And Daniel was a man that not only did he fast, he prayed, but he was constantly seeking God on behalf of his nation. That was his fight. That was his battle. And he was just a quote-unquote lowly Jew, basically. He was just a guy from Judah that was captive to the Persians. And so the story starts off with a guy named Nebuchadnezzar. And I don't know if y'all know anything about him, but this is Nebuchadnezzar here. And you can tell he likes being real fancy and that he is unimpressed with you. And, just this story starts off even strange. Let me read this thing. It says that God gives Nebuchadnezzar Jerusalem, which is a really weird thing, and I'm going to come back to that. But it says, the Lord gave the king of Judah into his hand, and some of the articles of the house of God even. So it says Nebuchadnezzar took some of the stuff out of God's house and brought it over in his God's house, which was an insane thought, but I'm going to explain that in a minute. Anyway, when he comes into power, he asked for... He says, I want you guys to go out and find me some young men with no blemish. I want them to be good looking. I want them to be gifted in all wisdom. I want them to possess knowledge, and I want them quick to understand. So I want intelligent, handsome guys to be on my squad here. And he's trying to build a squad of like soothsayers and wise men, right? And they're called different things in different kingdoms. Some of them call them prophets. Some of them call them wise men. Nebuchadnezzar called them soothsayers. Okay, that was his word for it. And he says, so Daniel ended up being one of them. He brings Daniel in, and he tells them, like, all right, I had a dream, and now that I got you soothsayers here, it's now your job, since I'm king, to interpret my dream for me. And I'm going to give you one day, and if you can't figure it out, then I'm going to kill all of you and cut you into pieces. So they're like, wow, okay, this is a horrible job. And so Daniel goes home that night and starts to pray, like, God, you got to tell me, you got to give me vision for this because I don't want to die. And this is not how I die. So tell me help me interpret his dream. So he comes back the next day. Nebuchadnezzar tells him the dream. And Daniel says, hold on, before you kill everyone, God spoke to me. The God of Israel spoke to me. So let me tell you what he says. He starts out by saying this, and I like to read this quote just because it means something to me. But he says, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and he raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what's in the darkness, and light dwells within him. I don't have any context for that. I just thought that was a really cool thing. This is what he dreams. So let me show you guys the visual for this. He has a dream about a statue, and the head's gold, and the body's made out of iron, and then it goes to bronze, and then it works its way down to all the way down to dirt or coal, basically. So what Daniel says is he says that God is giving you, Nebuchadnezzar, a vision of what is to come. This is a prophecy for the future of the nation of Persia. And I don't know if you know about Persia at that time. This is what it looked like under Nebuchadnezzar's rule. This was the biggest kingdom at that time, if you roll the clock back. They were huge. So Persia was sort of the pinnacle of men and what they could accomplish and what society could look like back then. But anyway, the crazy thing about this, now we're looking at this, 2,000 something years later, This is, and you can go and look this up for yourself, but this statue is actually dead on for how the future of Persia looks. And every single one of those different colors represents different kingdoms coming in and conquering and what that looks like for Persia. This is sort of like a roadmap. And like I said, this literally happens verbatim for how Daniel predicted it. So it's a really crazy thing. But back to Nebuchadnezzar here, being the guy that he is probably, his interpretation is like, sweet, that's a really rad looking statue. I look really jacked. I feel like what I should do with this information is build a gigantic one and have everyone worship it. So that's what he does. He builds a huge statue and he demands everyone in the entire kingdom come out and worship it. And there's 3 guys there, and you guys might know this story too, but they're friends of Daniel's. They're also Jewish, Christian guys. And they say, like, we can't do this. We can't bow down to Baal and Nebuchadnezzar. And, so Daniel's like, so imagine this. They're out in the crowd, and these 3 guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you guys have heard the story of them. They're out in the crowd, and Nebuchadnezzar's, let's just say, hypothetically, he's up here. Daniel's right next to him, right? Because Daniel's his soothsayer, or Daniel's his magician, or whatever you want to call it. And Daniel's like, it's going to be risky. He's probably going to kill you if you don't do it. Well, they don't. They don't do it. And he actually threatens them. He says, whoever doesn't bow, I'm going to throw him in this fiery furnace right off to the side here. So they don't bow. So he takes them and goes, all right, throw him in. So he throws them in, and it says that he looks over, Nebuchadnezzar does, and sees a 4th person in there with him. And, it was either an angel or it was Jesus himself. I don't know. There's a lot of study on that. But whatever the case, God was in the furnace with them and protected them from being burned. So he ends up opening the doors going, well, the fire's not working, obviously. Go ahead and let them out. So he lets them out, and there's no burns on them at all. They're 100% spot-free. So God spared them from that. But he turns to Daniel. This is pretty cool. He says Belshazzar, which is his, soothsayer name for Daniel. He, renamed Daniel. He says, chief of the magicians, Daniel, because I know the spirit of the holy God is in you, and no secret troubles you. He's saying, your God is obviously real, and the spirit of the real God lives inside of you to be able to do something like this, which you told me that those guys would be protected, and they were. But I did a little takeaway right here. Chief of magicians. I asked this question. Do you think the other Christians at that time of the Jewish people would look down on Daniel for having a title like that? Because it could easily seem from their perspective that Daniel was a traitor to the Christian faith, and that he was allowing himself to be called Belshazzar, which is a pagan name for soothsayer, or basically magician. It would be easy to judge as Christians, Daniel's on the other team. You see what I'm saying? It's one of those, back to the Chinese farmer thing. Well, that's really bad that he's working for Nebuchadnezzar, a well-known pagan who's against God. And here Daniel sits as his chief wizard, is what he's calling him. Obviously, Daniel's in the wrong. You see what I'm getting at here? About being careful to judge because you're not really sure. And sometimes God takes the chaos that men create and he works it out for good. You see what I'm saying? So then he says, and this is something I peeled off here. I put things, there could be more going on than what you can see, and that God judges the heart. And there's a verse wherever God sends Samuel at a different time in history. Samuel is being sent to go find King David, and he shows up to see David's brothers, and they all line up. And Samuel gets in front of the tall one that's handsome and goes, this has got to be the one right here. This dude looks like a king. He's got the broad shoulders and everything. And God says, do not look at his appearance or his height of stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as a man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So it's just a lesson there that there's more to what you see sometimes that's going on. So be slow to judge a situation. Like I said, the Christians at that time could have also said, God is allowing this pagan to rule over us. He has obviously left us. But I wrote down here, be careful what you're asking for, because you might not be speaking truth. And what does that mean? It actually says in John 16, 13, it says, when he, the Spirit of truth, has come, this is talking about the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, he will guide you in all truth, for he will not speak on his own authority, but whatever he hears, he will speak, and he will tell you what the things to come. So what's the lesson there for me when I read that is sometimes I'm speaking what I consider truth out of my own authority. You see what I'm saying? But it's saying here in the scripture that even the Holy Spirit doesn't do that. When it comes down and gives you actual truth comes from God. You see what I'm saying? So before you go and start making moves on your truth and what you think is right, make sure that you pray first and that you ask the Spirit of God to give you actual truth from the Father. Does that make sense? Because sometimes we can be guilty of getting caught up in our own authority truth instead of God's authority. And then I put on here, maybe God could have said to Israel, are you sure this isn't exactly what you prayed for in your own authority, a King Nebuchadnezzar? Sometimes, like I said, and I wrote down an example of this, we pray for, God, give me the job that I want, right? And then you get the job, and you come to church and you pray and you consecrate yourself, God, I'll do whatever it takes, God. I gotta seek you out. I'm gonna really seek you out so I can get this job. And then you get the job, and then you never go back to church again. Why? Why do you do that? Well, I got what I needed, And maybe instead of praying for that, maybe what we should be praying for is purpose and vision, right? Because if you pray for purpose and vision, then God will bring you and give you the ambition for the job that you need, the right one, the one that pays you well enough and where you can work the hours that you want to work while simultaneously still having God be part of your life. You see what I'm saying? And I know that doesn't hinge on whether or not you attend church, but sometimes your attendance to church, when you start to distance that, you just instinctually start to distance your relationship with God too. So this isn't about you getting marks on tally whether or not you attended. It's more are you still able to not go to church at all and keep God part of your life and have some consecration and concentrate on him? Because sometimes that's what coming to church brings. It's us setting aside time to bring God back into our picture. You see what I mean? Anyway, before you act, ask the Holy Spirit to reveal truth to you. That's kind of the lesson there. So back to the King Nebuchadnezzar ends up having another dream, and he has a dream about this huge tree, and it covers all the earth, and all the earth gets fruit from this huge tree, but in the dream, the tree gets cut down, right? And it falls over, and they chop it into pieces, and they burn it, and then they take the root trunk where it used to be, and they bind it with metal so that it could never grow again. And he's like, all right, Daniel, tell me what that means, because that dream sounds really trippy. And so Daniel says, well, I hate to say this, but this is a representation of you. Your kingdom, the kingdom of Babylon, is kind of at its peak. It's the, like I said, it's the pinnacle for all men. It's a representation of men and what they can do, which is this tree idea, but unfortunately, it's going to get cut down, and you're going to end up being driven mad, is basically what he tells him. And this is what happens. Nebuchadnezzar ends up getting kicked out, and this is an artist's representation of that. But he ended up going basically insane and loses his mind, and they drive him out to the field, and it says he's going to eat the grass of the cattle, and he's going to crawl on his hands and feet. And that's exactly what happens. Really, really strange. So what I want to talk about, let me get this graphic picture off. So I wrote down here, just to use Nebuchadnezzar's story really quick, of God working things out for good. And this is just my take, like I said. But it seemed like God was using Nebuchadnezzar whenever, at the beginning of the story, when I told you guys that he handed over Jerusalem to him. I mean, again, you could easily look at that and go, how could he ever do that? That doesn't seem like something God would do. Well, it says he did. It says he did in the text. So, but what you don't know, if you actually go look up the guy that was king at that time of Judah, that God removed out of authority. I mean, just go Wikipedia this guy. His name's Jehoiakim. It says he was the king of Judah at that time. Historically, he is portrayed as living in incest relations with his mom, his daughter-in-law, his stepmother, and he was in the habit of murdering people for fun. And then he would take their wives and violate them also and seize their property. So, pretty nasty dude, right? And I'm not saying that Nebuchadnezzar was a whole lot better. I'm saying sometimes God uses the chaos and tries to weave good inside of that. Let me Another time when Daniel is predicted this statue dream, even after he predicted that, Nebuchadnezzar says, your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings. He says that out of his own mouth. This guy who's very arrogant and pagan says that in front of his whole courtroom. Another time, it says he misunderstands the statue dream, like I told you guys a minute ago, makes the decree to build the huge thing, and sees the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out of it unscathed. He says that every people, nation, and language which speak anything against the God of these three guys, I'll cut them into pieces. So it's kind of an indirect compliment. It's a little violent one, but he's saying their God is so good, and he's the right God, so no one is allowed to speak against their God anymore from this day forward. I'll take it. If I was back then, I would take that. Because up until that point, when you're sitting underneath a pagan king, you're not even allowed to talk about the God of Jerusalem. You're not allowed to talk about Jesus. You're not allowed to talk about any of that. So that's kind of a big deal. And even when he was cast out, it says in the Bible, and he ate grass like an ox, and his body wet with the dew of heaven. Even then he says, I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever. So even in his state of rejection, he was still honoring God that he had that encounter with. That's pretty wild. So lastly, though, this is one of the coolest that I read, that whenever it seemed like God was at work when Nebuchadnezzar, as he watched 3 and then 4 people be in the furnace, and he looked in and said, he's the first person in the Bible, Jew or Gentile, to ever utter the words, the Son of God. That's what he says when he looks in. He looks in and says, that's the Son of God, inside of that thing with him. So this is Nebuchadnezzar, in spite of his chaos, in my opinion, God kind of using what he can, working things out for good. So fast forward in the story, I'm going to jump ahead and kind of tell the Cliff Notes version of this, but his son comes into power, and his name's Belshazzar, and he's the guy, I don't know if you know the story, but they're like at a feast, and this big, huge hand comes in the wall and writes this sayings on the wall. So then Daniel comes in the next day and predicts it for him. He says, here's what these things mean. Unfortunately, the last thing in the sentence means that you're going to die. And so the guy actually dies the next day. It says the Chaldeans come in and slay the guy the very next night. So that was a really short reign there that he set underneath Nebuchadnezzar's son. So then another guy comes in. King Darius is this guy's name. He takes over the kingdom. And this is the king that was in charge when the whole lion's den incident happened. And he has a vision. Daniel has a vision about the future of Persia. And I want to read it. Daniel's vision has 2 rams with horns, and then there's this large ram with a single horn that comes in and overtakes the smaller ram. And so Gabriel, the Archangel messenger, this is the same Gabriel, an angel that came to Mary, right? This is like God's messenger that goes out and sends warnings, but he comes to Daniel and says, he interprets this dream and tells him that it was a prelude. He's basically saying, this is what's to come for the future of Persia. They're going to be overtaken by the Greeks. And so he actually predicts this story, which I don't know if you guys watch movies or not. This is really interesting to me. I have no context other than this is cool. But he's predicting the Greeks coming in, okay? So if you watch 300, you know the Battle of Thermopylae, where Persia tries to invade Greece. He's predicting the beginning of this, which leads to this. And so this vision that Daniel's having is saying, this is coming for Persia. And Persia's not going to last. It's going to be overtaken by the Greeks. There's a storm brewing, and it's starting at a small scale, but it's going to grow and eventually take over. The entire nation's going to fall. And so because he says this, by law, the king is like, I got to throw you in jail. You're speaking against the kingdom. Sends him to the lion's den, right? And then, when you're a kid, you see like the paintings of the evil king sitting over the top. And he's like, yeah, eat them, lions. Well, that's not really what happens in the story. It says the king is actually so disturbed because Daniel was such a man of honor, and he was so respectful and so revered for worshiping his God and being devout. It actually says the king felt bad about it. It says he went home that night and could barely sleep. He felt so bad about casting Daniel into this lion's den, but he knew that he had to do it. He actually says, as he threw Daniel in, he kind of walks off and says, it says he was greatly displeased with himself, but he turns to Daniel and says, your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you, just like he has all the other times before. So I'm nervous, but I'm going to bed tonight hoping that your God's got you. But he's got you. He's always had you this whole time. He's got you this time. So it says he rushed down the next day to find Daniel hanging out with the lions. And even though they were all starving and hungry, he shows up and Daniel's sitting there, no big deal, just hanging out. And says the king, like, I'm so happy. I was tormented all night thinking that you were going to eat and you weren't. I knew your God would save you, and sure enough, he did. So that's kind of the lion's den story. But the story part that I want to focus in on, and I'll kind of lead to my close here, but this is the next move for Persia. And this is after King Darius, right? So this new king comes in, and this is King Cyrus the Great. If you've ever heard of him, very good king for Persia. The Persians love this guy, and he's still revered to this day, by the way. You go look up Cyrus's tomb. They have like gigantic parades around this guy's tomb. Very good king, very fair, treated everyone in the kingdom correctly. And Daniel's time underneath his rule wasn't so bad. Daniel was relieved to see this guy in power. But this is kind of what it looked like under his rule. So it says that the Cyrus rule marked a fundamental shift in Middle Eastern history, the creation of the largest empire the world had ever seen. Up until that point, he ruled over the entirety of the Eastern Mediterranean, effectively creating the Middle East as we know it today. So I'm just showing you to show they had a season of prosperity here, where the kingdom was doing really well, and they had a great king, and it seemed like everything was going swimmingly, except for Daniel has this encounter. And, he's already had the dream of the ram coming in and the Greeks eventually coming in, and he was pleading on behalf of the nation. And, where do us Christians fit in this equation? I know we're slaves technically in this Persian empire, but how does this all work out? And he was fearful, right? Well, it says that Gabriel comes back to Daniel again and gives him a 70-week prophecy about Jerusalem and what's going to happen to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's part of this equation. You can see it way over here. That's Jerusalem. And then Persepolis, which, here's Babylon here. These are all major capitals. Anyway, the Archangel Gabriel comes to him and says, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in a vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time in the evening offering. He says, O Daniel, I have come now forth to give you skill to understand. At the beginning of your supplications, the command went out. In other words, from the very time that you started praying about this, the command from God went out for us to make moves. And I've come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore, consider the matter and understand the vision. And so Daniel is overwhelmed by this idea of what has to happen and what's going to take place. And think about, kind of what I said at the beginning. He's praying for the entirety of his nation. It's not just himself. He's praying for like all of Israel and all of Jerusalem. He wants his people to make it out and to be healthy and to be protected. And it says in the third year of King Cyrus's rule, Daniel is mourning for Israel for 3 full weeks. He says he understands and knows the prophecy heard from God, and he decides to fast on behalf of Israel. It says that he ate no pleasant food and no wine came to his mouth. I put a big bold text here that says fasting with a question mark around it. I think I've talked to you guys before about, and I brought this slide from a sermon I've done before, but I've talked about how you're both parts, and Paul talks about this. He says that you're both flesh and spirit, and he says that one is fighting for dominance in your life every single day, right? You guys have heard the story before about the 2 wolves fighting on the inside of you, the old Indian tale. Which one wins? And the answer is the one you feed the most that day. So, fasting, just to talk about that for a second, because this is really interesting. If you go read stories in the Bible, a lot of like spiritual and supernatural breakthroughs happen while people are fasting. And what it is, it's whenever you fast, you're suppressing this side of you, the flesh side. This is the side sometimes that gets you in trouble, right? This is the side where, remember I was telling earlier how you sometimes want justice, but you want your version of justice. You want your own authority's justice instead of God's. So what fasting does is it presses down the side of us that produces all these things: the sexual immorality, impurity, idolatry, hatred, discord, jealousy. So, and when you fast, it starves that side out, right? And so it allows your spirit to be able to like connect with God better. It's the best way I can say it. And I'm saying that based on things that happen in the Bible. Like, there's a time where the Israelites are losing. They go into battle and they lose 40,000 men in battle in 2 days. That's a lot of people. And so they're like at their wits' end. Like God has to come through. This is not going to work. So they go up to Bethel, which is like a mountaintop, and they pray and they fast. It says they prayed and they fasted for the entire day. And it says the very next day the Lord gave them the victory. Another time, when Moses, y'all know about the 10 Commandments of Moses, right? Well, read before that. It says that he went up for 40 days and he fasted with God. He prayed and he fasted with God for 40 days. Then he came down with the 10 Commandments. And then even Jesus, if you study him, before Jesus started his ministry, he went into the desert, it says for 40 days, and he fasted and got his spirit right, because he knew what he was about to do would require a really strong spirit. You know what I'm saying? To be able to accomplish what he was going to accomplish. Anyway, I just put on there that fasting could be the gateway sometimes to the breakthrough maybe that you need in your life. I'm not telling everyone they should fast. I'm just saying maybe you should. If you need like a big breakthrough, it sounds like it kind of went that way in the Bible. Anyway, Daniel's fasting for 3 weeks, so 21 days, it says. He was fasting and praying for his nation, going like, God, something has to change. So it says that he was on his 24th day of his fast, and he has a vision down by the river. So he's down by the river Tigris, which is over in Persia, and he has a vision, and it says that there was a sound. He was down at the water. At this point, I don't know if you guys have ever tried to fast, but it makes you kind of weak, right, and frail. So it says at this point, Daniel was kind of weak and frail, and he was down by the river, and there was other people there. And a sound came about, and it says that they all took off running, except for Daniel stayed. And it says, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose waist was girdled with gold, body was like emerald, face like lightning, eyes like torches of fire, his arms and feet like bronze in color, and the sound of his words like the voice of a multitude. If I had a voice effect that could do that, I would read it that way, because I think that would be pretty rad. Suddenly a hand touched me, which made me tremble on my knees and on the palms of my hands. So he's down on all fours at this point, and he's basically broken. And he feels like this problem is so big, it's just flat out of his control, and he doesn't know what to do. And he's kind of at his wit's end here, and he's collapsing out of fatigue, not just physical fatigue, but at this point, it's spiritual fatigue. He's spent. He's prayed his guts out. He's done everything he knows how to do. And he says to Daniel, "O man, Daniel, greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you." Like God himself has sent me to you. While he was speaking this word, I stood trembling. So Daniel's up on his feet at this point, and he's trembling. And this is the verse that I kind of wanted to focus in on today. And this is, you can put this one up. It's Daniel 10. It says, "Then he said to me, do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourselves before your God, your words were heard. I have come literally because of your words." And so I think it's a cool thought. It's a cool thought, and it actually says this in the Bible, that your words can actually put angels to flight. I don't know if you know that or not, but it says that your words and your prayers can actually put 1,000 angels to flight. And then later on, and if you read from Moses, Moses says, when one prays and contends on something for God, it puts 1,000 to flight. But when two do it, they put 10,000 to flight. So that's just a lesson or something behind coming together like this and thanking God and worshiping God. But back to the story here, he says that this is the angel speaking to him now. He says, "But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. So what he's telling Daniel here is, I've been sent to you, but I've been being held up by the prince of Persia for 21 days. I've been fighting him in the supernatural, right? So when it says prince of Persia, it's not talking about the actual prince. This is talking about the spirit behind Persia that was lording over them and running them. And so, I'm a visual person. I've got all these visuals for you guys. So whenever he talks about the Prince of Persia ruling over ancient Babylon, and I read things like I did at the beginning where Moses says the spiritual forces and the spirit of rebellion that was behind the men, this is what I think about. And yeah, it's creepy looking. My computer's not working. There it goes. Creepy, yeah? But that's what comes in my head, right? Maybe I watched too many movies. That could be true. But I think about evil spirits, and that I think of them lording over men as men make their moves, and they make their decisions, and they make their judgments. And so you can go to the next one. I think of it kind of this evil spirit that's over ancient Babylon. This is what it looks like to me. But let me keep reading. He says, I came to you, I was being caused to fly to you. I came because of your words, but I was held up by the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. And he says, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. So it's plural at this point. He's saying there are multiple spirits that I'm fighting against that are lording over Persia right now. That's going to lead to their demise. And I just wanted you to know, Daniel, that because of your words, we're now contending. And your words have reached up so high that the Archangel Michael himself has come. And I made, let's see if it'll play correctly. This is what I envision when I see Archangel Michael fighting. Yes, this is from a video game. Yes, I watched too many movies. But this is what I picture to me. And so if you know anything, or you read the text, Michael is basically the champion of heaven. It's God's extension as a warrior, basically. This is the highest ranking angel there is. So it's a really cool thought to think that Daniel, contending for his nation like that, was able to put angels to flight in his situation. But I'm going to read. He says, now I have come to make you understand, Daniel, what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision refers for many days yet to come. And like I said earlier, this is heavy for Daniel. Hearing about the Greeks coming in and taking over is a scary thought to him. But it says another figure shows up, and this is the one that could be Jesus. I don't know. It just says that it was a heavenly-like figure that comes down to Daniel and picks him up and says, Daniel, peace, fear not. Peace be with you. Be strong. Yes, be strong. And then the angel says, and now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I have gone forth, indeed, the prince of Greece will still come. But I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth. In other words, I'm going to show you how God is moving through this so that you will have peace and that you'll be strong. And just know that God has sent his best to help in the situation. I don't know what you guys are going through. Everybody's situations are different. Like I said, it could be anything from internal struggle to external. It could be you fighting for your own peace, you fighting for peace in your household, for unity in your family. It could be you contending for your nation and praying for God to be in your nation, a godly nation that serves and follows him, and that there would be true godly justice, not just the justice of what men think, but the kind of justice that what God wants. And it's cool to hear that our words can put angels to flight. But I want to point out a couple things before. I'm going to leave you guys with some closing challenges. But before that, I just want to point out, Daniel wasn't anti-Persia, okay? He was anti the spirits that were lording over Persia, right? The things he was coming against wasn't, he served underneath some decent kings, but he served underneath some terrible ones too, right? Like Nebuchadnezzar was pretty violent and threatened to murder him several times. So he wasn't even against him. He wasn't even praying like, God, bring judgment on Persia and destroy them so that we can break out. No, he was praying against the spirits that get behind men sometimes when they're in power. And I know you guys know all about that. You've seen what that looks like. You've seen people get compromised as soon as they taste a little bit of power. It tends to do that to you. And if you're not careful, you can fall subject to the same thing. Let me go back here. So I got a couple closing challenges that I would want to ask you guys. Is your flesh perspective and the way of you seeing God? Kind of like that thing I showed you guys a minute ago. Are you so full up on your spirit sometimes that you start making moves out of your authority instead of God's authority? It says that, are you feeding your spirit enough so that when problems arrive and you need the discernment, that you'll have the supernatural perception to see what God's doing? whenever the angel came to Daniel at the river, it says there were people there, and they ran off because they couldn't see anything. So that's a question to us as Christ followers. Like, the guys around Daniel couldn't see anything, but they felt something odd, so they ran off. So this is like a reminder that we can be close to the power and the presence of God, but miss it because of our lack of spiritual perception, right? So this is one of those things like, God's moving all the time, and there's miracles all the time. Can you see them? And have you prayed enough and allowed enough of your spirit to be a part of your life that you can actually acknowledge the blessings of God on your life as they happen? Because I think sometimes you can get real tone deaf to it and not even notice it. And then before you know it, you're like, oh, that's just luck. Maybe it's luck. Maybe it was God working something out for you on purpose, and it was intentional. And maybe it's because your grandma prayed it through, and it's just not making its way here. You see what I'm saying? So again, there's always more to it than what we know is going on. Number 2, we've learned how to fight while walking with God. I mean, that's like part of our job. How do we contend against bigger things that are bigger than us? And I put in here that pray that you are really in truth, that you're seeking the spirit of truth about your situation before you fight. And I want to reread that verse. It says, the spirit of truth comes. He will guide you in all truth, for he will not speak on his own authority, but whatever he hears, he will speak, and he will tell you the things to come. So we have access to that same spirit. Whenever Jesus left the earth, he says, I'm sending one that's better than me. His name is the Holy Spirit. And if you will ask for guidance from him, this goes for any situation that you're in. It doesn't matter. There's no such thing as a situation that's too small. It doesn't have to be you contending for your nation. This could be a fight that you have with a sibling. But before you make any moves, before you swing the sword, pray and ask that the spirit of truth would guide you in all truth, just like it says right here. We have access to that. As Christians, God says that you have access to that at any time. Pray for that in your life before you swing. And then lastly, my last thing is, my question would just be, do you need a breakthrough for whatever problem you have right now? Do you need a big breakthrough in your life? And I mean like a big breakthrough, because, you know, I've talked to guys that have struggled with addiction, for example. It's really hard to break it off by changing your habits. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying it's really hard. And even after you go through rehab and stuff like that, it can still come back on your life. So what you need sometimes is you need supernatural breakthrough. And, you know, this is just something I would ask. You know, like if you really need breakthrough in your life, you need God to break a stronghold in your life completely. That you might want to consider praying and fasting. You know, there's a scripture in Mark where Jesus, it comes to the disciples and they're around this kid. And the kid, it says the kid has an unclean spirit. So it's basically, in other words, demon possessed. And I guess he's acting insane. And they're like arguing with the scribes, it says, and they're disputing on whether or not the kid can't get healed from it. And Jesus rebukes the unclean spirit, and the spirit, it says the spirit convulsed and then came out of the kid. And then, so they walked off, and the disciples came to Jesus, and they're like, it says they came to him privately, and they said, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind of stronghold, this kind of thing in your life, there are certain things in your life that can only come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. And this is one of those things. So I don't know if you have something like that in your life, but I would challenge you to pray. Not only just pray, but if it's something big and you really need your spirit to move and to grow, and you need God to speak to you about something so that a stronghold can be broken off your life, or a situation can really change and completely turn around, you might want to consider that. I'm not saying you should do it. I'm just saying consider it. Pray about it. Pray about maybe God's asking you to do that. Maybe your flesh has become a lot more powerful than you think. Maybe you fed it so much it's become like a monster in your life. And if you take a little time starving that out and focusing on building your spirit man back up, God could begin to show you things in your life. And that's something that we talk about here. If you get anything out of this, if you get anything out of coming tonight for Night of Worship, I hope that it's a relationship with God, because that relationship is what feeds you and drives you forward and keeps you holding on. You see what I'm saying? To hope, holding on to hope for things like our nation and where our future is headed. you will maintain hope for that. It comes from God. It comes from the truth of God. You see what I'm saying? And I want to close on this. I'm going to pray, but I want to close on this last sentence. You guys can go ahead and stand if you would. But if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves. You can't humble yourself if you think you're right about everything. So it starts with going like, God, I don't want to keep pushing what I think ought to happen, God, and keep speaking out of my own authority. I'm going to pause for a minute, God. I'm going to pray, and I'm going to ask for you to show me what the Father's saying. Show me what the authority of the Father's saying, and let me pray and act on that. So I'm going to pray this over today, and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways. I will hear from heaven. I will forgive their sin and heal their land.
Well, thanks for watching with us. We hope you enjoyed the message today. We always want to give you an opportunity to be a part of what God is doing around here. So if you'd like to give, you can text LS Church to 77977 or head over to our website at lschurch.tv. Again, thanks for watching. I hope you have an amazing week, and we hope you'll join us again next week.